In the quiet suburban city of Palmdale, California, nestled in the high desert of the Antelope Valley northeast of Los Angeles, there lived a boy who loved to draw. He sketched superheroes in the margins of his notebooks, dreamed of being loved, and smiled through bruises that told a story no child should ever have to tell. His name was Gabriel Fernandez. He was 8 years old. Gabriel was born on February 20, 2005. His early years were spent with his maternal grandparents, Robert and Terry Fernandez, who raised him with warmth and consistency while his mother struggled with the instability that had long defined her life. By all accounts, those early years were the good ones. Gabriel was playful, curious, and deeply affectionate. He idolized his grandfather. He spent long afternoons kicking soccer balls in the yard and chasing his cousins through the neighborhood. Neighbors who knew the family remembered him as the kind of child who always waved hello, always said please and thank you, always made you feel seen. He had a contagious laugh, teachers would later recall. He had a light. But in the spring of 2012, the fragile stability Gabriel had known. The abuse began almost immediately. From the first weeks Gabriel lived in that apartment on East Avenue J, Isauro Aguirre established a regime of control and cruelty that escalated with terrifying speed. Gabriel was forced to sleep in a small wooden cabinet beneath the living room television, locked inside with a bike lock each night. He was denied regular meals. He was made to clean the apartment at hours when other children were sleeping. He was isolated from friends, from family, from anyone who might ask questions. His mother, Pearl Fernandez, did not protect him. She participated. In August of 2012, just a few weeks into the new school year at Summerwind Elementary School in Palmdale, Gabriel arrived at class with bruising on his face and neck. His teacher noticed immediately. Gabriel told her his mother had hit him. The school filed a report with the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services, the agency responsible, by law and by mission, for protecting children in exactly Gabriel's situation. A social worker visited the home. Pearl Fernandez explained away the injuries. The case was closed. Over the following months, DCFS would receive 4 separate reports about Gabriel, for separate moments when the safety net held out its hand and then withdrew it. Teachers called. Nurses. By May of 2013, Gabriel Fernandez had been living in that apartment for nearly a year. His body was failing under the accumulated weight of months of injury. On the morning of May 22, 2013, a 911 call was placed from the apartment on East Avenue J. Pearl Fernandez told the dispatcher that her son had stopped breathing. When Palmdale Fire Department paramedics arrived at the scene, what they encountered was almost beyond comprehension. Gabriel lay unresponsive on the floor of the apartment. He was barely recognizable as the bright-eyed boy who had once kicked soccer balls in his grandparents' yard. His skull had been fractured in multiple places. 3 of his ribs were broken, and showing signs of older fractures that had been allowed to heal without medical treatment. His shoulder was fractured. His body was covered from head to toe in burns, cuts, bruises, and abrasions. Several of his teeth had been knocked out. He had BB pellets embedded beneath the skin of his body. Paramedics initiated CPR on the scene and rushed him to Antelope Valley Hospital. He was stabilized enough to be transferred to Children's Hospital Los Angeles, where a team in the intensive care unit received. Within hours of Gabriel's death, Pearl Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre were taken into custody. The criminal investigation moved quickly. The evidence of what had happened inside the apartment on East Avenue J was overwhelming and immediate. Crime scene investigators processed the apartment and documented a scene of prolonged violence. Gabriel's blood was found on the walls. The cabinet where he had been forced to sleep was photographed. The BB gun was recovered. Neighbors, who had heard screaming from the apartment for months but had hesitated to call authorities, now came forward in numbers. But a second investigation, in some ways more consequential for the broader public, was already beginning. How had Gabriel Fernandez been reported to Child Protective Services 4 times, and how had the system failed to remove him? The Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services launched an internal review. The California Department of Social Services reviewed DCFS's procedures. Journalists from the Los Angeles Times and other outlets began requesting records. What emerged was a portrait of systemic failure at multiple levels. The social workers who had handled Gabriel's case had conducted cursory home visits. Pearl Fernandez was 29 years old when Gabriel died. She had grown up in difficult circumstances, poverty, instability, a cycle of relationships that brought harm rather than stability. Those circumstances explained something of how she had arrived at that apartment on East Avenue J. But they explained nothing about the choices she made once she was there. Isauro Aguirre was 34. He had a documented history of violence and had served time in prison before meeting Pearl. He was not Gabriel's father. He had no prior relationship with the child. And yet, from the moment Gabriel entered the home, Aguirre directed his aggression toward him with a relentlessness that investigators and prosecutors would later describe as sadistic. Neighbors and associates interviewed by law enforcement described Aguirre as controlling and volatile, a man who demanded absolute compliance from everyone around him, and who expressed particular contempt for Gabriel. Investigators found evidence that Aguirre had made derogatory remarks about the boy, had speculated disparagingly about Gabriel's sexuality, and had used those beliefs, however unfounded, as a pretext for abuse. The prosecution's case against Isauro Aguirre, who maintained his not guilty plea and proceeded to trial, was built on an architecture of evidence so extensive that it consumed weeks of courtroom testimony. Medical examiners testified to the scope and nature of Gabriel's injuries. The autopsy had documented wounds consistent with months of repeated, deliberate physical trauma. There were healing fractures layered beneath fresh ones. There were burns in various stages of recovery. There were contusions of different ages across virtually every surface of his body. Beyond the forensic evidence, the testimony of Gabriel's teachers at Summerwind Elementary proved perhaps the most emotionally devastating element of the trial. One teacher after another took the stand and described what they had witnessed over the course of the 2012 to 2013 school year. Gabriel arriving with a swollen eye. Gabriel arriving with burns on his arms. Gabriel arriving with teeth missing, with cut hair, with a BB pellet visible beneath the skin of his cheek. They described filling out report after report. They described calling DCFS. They described pulling Gabriel aside and asking him directly what was happening. The trial of Isauro Aguirre opened in June 2018 in Los Angeles County Superior Court. It was, by any measure, a difficult case to sit through. Deputy District Attorneys Jonathan Hatami and Olivia Kosh prosecuted the case with methodical intensity, presenting evidence day after day that built a picture of a child systematically destroyed by two adults he had been given no choice but to trust. The defense faced an almost insurmountable challenge. The evidence of abuse was extensive, documented, and physically indisputable. Their strategy centered on arguing that Pearl Fernandez bore greater culpability, that Aguirre had not been present for all of the injuries, that Pearl had more control over the household than the prosecution claimed, and that the jury could not determine beyond a reasonable doubt that Aguirre specifically had inflicted each documented wound. Prosecutors responded by presenting the totality of the evidence. This was not a case about one incident or one night. It was a case about 9 months. 9 months of injuries. 9 months of reports. 9 months in which. On August 22, 2018, the jury returned to the courtroom with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. Isauro Aguirre was convicted of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of torture, a conviction that made him eligible for the death penalty under California law. The penalty phase followed. In January 2019, after hearing additional testimony about the circumstances of both the crime and Aguirre's life history, the jury recommended the death sentence. The judge accepted the recommendation. Isauro Aguirre was sentenced to death. He currently sits on death row at San Quentin State Prison. The social workers charged in 2016, Patricia Clement, Gregory Merritt, Jennifer Vaines, and Kevin Boehm, did not ultimately face conviction. In 2020, a judge dismissed the charges, ruling that the prosecution had not met the legal threshold required to proceed to trial. For Gabriel's family, and for child welfare advocates who had watched the case closely, the dismissal was a second wound. The system that had failed Gabriel had now, in their view, also failed to hold itself accountable. But Gabriel's name did not fade. In 2020, Netflix